architect within Microsoft. So good afternoon to you both. So I think Pramod, you're in just the other side of the Irish Sea from where I am in the UK. You're in Ireland, and Hilary, you're joining us on the East Coast, I believe.
I am, yes, in the New York area. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And last but not least, Dean. So my colleague Dean Ramsey. Good afternoon, Dean. Dean is just a little bit north and east of where I am in London. So Dean is based in Norfolk. Dean's principal analyst at TM Forum. And how we're going to manage the session today is that I'm going to be steering the discussion between myself, Pramod, and Hilary. You, our audience, we invite you to use the Q&A function if anything that you hear is interesting, if it triggers an idea or a thought, or you have a question, please use that Q&A box. And every so often, Dean's going to stop me and he's going to say, look, I've got a really interesting question coming in from someone, and we'll stop and we'll ask the question. So we want to make it as dynamic as we can. That's why Dean and I are both on the session today. Just one last point before we start today, which is that you don't need to worry about recording the session. We're going to be sending you out a link to it in the next 24, 48 hours. So you're very free to re-listen to that or to send to your colleagues. So good afternoon, everybody, and looking forward to today's discussion. And I think in terms of my opening question here would be, and this really picks up on what I just mentioned to you, that when we look at the increased complexity, fragmentation from a networking perspective, we're thinking about multiple clouds, multiple networks, multiple points of entry. To what extent is this resulting in increased security risks? And Hilary, if I can just sort of put that one to you first.
Yeah, sure. And I'll give a very high level answer. I think as we get into different questions, we're going to go deeper and deeper. But my day job here is in the cloud space, and I work with clients that are looking at hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. And we did a survey recently that said that folks are using between 9 and 47 clouds, and you say, well, where do you get to 47? Well, it's because different independent environments, especially from a networking perspective, are often considered a different cloud. Different private cloud instantiations or different cloud environments on public cloud providers. And so the data is clear that multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, many clouds is where the market is at, and complexity and heterogeneity are the enemy of visibility, yeah. And that is the enemy of having robustness in cybersecurity. And so I think that there's certainly a change in the dynamics, that are going on. Do I think that necessarily, though, leads to higher cyber risk? No, because it's possible to plan and architect and instrument and other things like that. But there does need to be an acknowledgement that there is more planning and more architecture and more intentionality needed in this reality of a very complex environment in terms of public cloud and hybrid cloud and edge deployments and all those other things that are going on in this space.
And I guess the context of that is that telcos themselves are starting to use cloud more. And we do, Dean and I do a lot of work looking at telcos' transformation strategies and moving towards more private cloud, more public cloud. So I guess when we think of these issues, we're thinking about telcos as consumers of cloud, and I guess also providers of services to enterprises themselves. So I guess both those domains we need to be considering. Absolutely. So Pramod, if I can just move over to you, maybe I'll ask the same question to you. This fragmentation, complexity is something that we need to be aware of and manage.
Yeah, and thank you for having us on this session, Mark. And as Hilary mentioned, yes, there's a lot of fragmentation going on, right? Now let's take a step back, right? If you look 6-7 years back even, the entire network, be it enterprise or service providers, had a perimeter. They did have their own data centers. They did have virtualization happening, but not virtualization in the sense we are speaking today. They were virtual machines to a certain extent, which was a virtual form of the hardware factor. It was all within a data center. To secure the data centers, you had firewalls. And Bob was your uncle, right? Life was beautiful. But then suddenly, there's an expansion of hybrid mode of working. There's an expansion of the way you deploy the network. That is what we mean by fragmentation. and the network essentially becomes perimeterless. Now, when you have a perimeterless concept, that is still okay. Let's say you can secure certain aspects, but now within those perimeterless deployment layers, you have got polyglot based architectures. So each of the instances now are cloud native functions, and they are made up of different languages like Rust. You've got Python and different kind of language streams coming in, Golang and things like those. It becomes very difficult for a service provider to find the vulnerabilities. And I'm sure we'll have further deeper discussions going forward, but on a very high level, definitely the complexity has increased. Definitely there has been a lot of fragmentation, and we have not yet touched serverless. There was a hardware, there was a virtual machine, there was a container, and there was a polyglot containers, and now you got serverless. So we are not even touching the tip of the iceberg. Very exciting direction of the industry, Mark.
And I'm imagining that people listening to this webinar today, a lot of them are going to be architects, engineers, maybe some data science people, some security people, I would hope. Is it clear what people's roles are when it comes to managing security? I mean, and I guess maybe a follow-up to that is, in terms of how operators structure their security operations, again, is it clear where responsibilities and roles and structures lie? Hilary, maybe if I could just come to you first.
I think it can be made clear. And I see some organizations that we work with who are doing an outstanding job in this space, but I think it is different than it used to be in the past. And Pramod went there right away out of the bat, right? There used to be physical devices run by network operations teams, and you set up physical, perimeters and things like that. With all of the changes, toward software defined and all those other kind of things, with the changes toward DevOps and DevSecOps, et cetera, the power to set up a virtual private cloud, for example, is now in the hands of people who don't work for the networking infrastructure team, who don't necessarily work for the infrastructure security team. It's in the hands of developers to write scripts in Terraform, and suddenly they are up doing network security. Whether it's virtual network functions or whatever it is, this change means that it can be clear who has responsibility, but it is almost certainly a different set of people at many places in this entire environment who now are responsible for security. And that gets into skills, it gets into process, it gets into different ways of working. I've seen some incredibly creative and effective things happening in some organizations that are now putting the risk and IT people together with their developers when they start development sprints or when they start deployment sprints or other things like that. Whereas before there used to be a very static schedule that wrote out when you were going to do the network security implementations on all those, hardware devices at the perimeter. Now it has to be more, sprint based. It has to be integrated culturally, that you're looking at, the cyber design and the network security design and other things like that. As you're going through a development process, it's not necessarily a different set of people that parachute in for one stage of either a development or a design or a deployment.
So is it something that needs to be just baked in to different roles and functional roles rather than it being just a dedicated team that does this?
I think it's both, right? This is so complicated, and I'm sure Pramod has great insight on this as well, right? But this is so complicated, you still do need architecture, right? I mean, the space that he works in, right? You need that security architecture, you need security reviews, you need other things like that. But you also need to then infuse and change the way that certain roles are upskilled in order to understand topics of network security. So I think it's really both. The traditional, review and design still needs to happen and has become even more complex. There's key issues around vendor selection and processes and other things like that. But then in the day-to-day, there also needs to be a change in the working model to be most effective from what I'm seeing.
Thanks. Pramod, do you want to come in? Anything you want to add there to?
Yeah, sure. And Hilary has touched upon many of those points, right? So if you look at the way the service providers, the telco operators have evolved, it's amazing, right? If you look at the previous model, they had an RF. Let's talk about the telco infrastructure first, then the IT and different stuff. They had an RF planning engineer. They had RF optimization engineers. They had backhaul engineers. They had packet core engineers. Of course, they still have. They have then the peering routing infrastructures. Then came the point of SDN. So now they had SDN engineers. Then they had orchestration. Then they had orchestration engineers. The layers are multi-layered now. And today, many of these engineers and architects are cross-pollinated. They understand each other's network quite well. This was not the case 10 years back. An RF optimization engineer, a planning engineer would not really know what a core engineer does on the parameter stuff and things like those. Not even today, but to a certain extent, there has been an overlap. Why is that important? Security, they all should be security aware, is what is my point. They need not be experts on security. They should be aware. And definitely we need security architects, at least one guy looking, or a team looking at the end-to-end story. That is extremely important now, including the IT part, because many of the threat surfaces, or let's look at the strategy, right? So whenever people make strategy, very few really look at the assets. For example, I want to go at 5G or 6G, that is super cool, right? But what is the asset? Do they support a lot of security features or implementations on cross technology? So if, and many service providers are doing that today, they have got a strategy with a link to the assets, and that is where the real architecture comes in. And yes, you need specific people to have that end-to-end view, else there will be a crack in the architecture.
Okay. And going back to this question about how you structure your approach to roles, is there a playbook emerging, or are people just feeling their way into this, and every company will be a little bit different based on their legacy, their architectures, their technology partners?
I can't say that I'm seeing a playbook necessarily that's consistent. I'm seeing a set of best practices for sure, right? You know, so more agility in terms of the design and review process, those integration of both security and risk people into the, design and development, as well as the deployment stages. Ensuring that there is, a leadership level acknowledgement that there's a power shift here, right? That a CISO isn't just going to come in and check things or have a team reporting to them that ensures security, that the responsibility is now dispersed throughout an organization, et cetera. And I think there's also, changes happening, in the spaces of understanding, supply chain and other things like that are also becoming best practices. You can flippantly say, oh, well, it's DevSecOps or other things like that. But I don't think that there's, standardization around kind of run books and playbooks on this. I think there are sets of best practices that are emerging, in my opinion. But Pramod, are you seeing any kind of more structure to this than I am?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Hilary, because the evolution of network is so rapid, right? A new technology comes in every 10 years. We all know that, right? 2G to 3G, 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G, or Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi 6, or things like those, because the service providers need the return on investments. Now, the reason, speaking about the playbook specifically, the reason of we don't have a playbook is because the network is so flexible and is so plasma. It's not gaseous, it's not solid, it's not solid, right? It's plasma state. And because of that state, it's very hard to have a playbook defined, because it can be dangerous. Because if you have a playbook set defined, you're supposed to follow this structure, and that might not apply to the evolving architectures. So no, we don't. I personally have not seen in a defined playbook. Of course, there are best practices and things like those. Even that, to a certain extent, is diluted, because people just don't know. They need a guidance. We should just stop shoving products down their throat, and they need somebody to tell them, hey, look at, this is the architecture view, and this is the direction.
Great. So I think, so let's start thinking about operators and whether, you mentioned, Hilary, that you know a couple of great examples of telcos doing this well. So let's ask our audience now. We have a very, very simple poll question for you. It's a bit of fun. It's a binary choice. So Ellie, if you could just pull up that poll question for us. Are telecoms operators investing enough in security to counter the growing threat of cyber attacks? So it's a simple yes or no. We thought of giving you a not sure answer, but then if we put not sure, then people just fill that in. So we thought we'll give you a binary choice. We'll give you just 10 more seconds.
It's not fair that the panelists cannot vote, Mark.
Well, I'm gonna ask you. Maybe I should ask you what you would have voted, but maybe that puts you in difficult positions. So maybe
it does. To be honest, yes.
So I'll save you the embarrassment of that. So okay, so let's take a look at the answers. Okay, so Pramod, maybe I'll go with you first. Is it what you'd expected?
Yes.
So you say yes, but why? I mean,
why? Yeah, good point. So let me clarify that point, right? So the thing is that as your company, my company, Hillary's company, we all have margins. We all have losses and profits and things like those. We have got OPEX costs, CAPEX costs. If I am a service provider and I want to invest in any vendor or any security product, I would accept, first of all, I would accept that vendor's equipment with an amount of risk which I know that I can adopt, right? Any vendor in the world today, nobody is 100% secure and nobody can claim to be 100% secure. They can just claim to follow that, okay, we follow the best practices, we are hardened and things like those. Nobody can say we are 100% secure, right? That will be foolish. So even after buying or investing in those products, we also need to invest on security, which is actually a cost center. Right? It is not giving me revenue. Like, for example, if I deploy a radio-based system, if I deploy packet code, it's bringing me revenue. But when I invest in security, it's a cost center where I don't get revenue unless and until I use that model for the monetization part. Right? So slowly by slowly, because of the new threat surfaces, the thinking of many CISOs, many CIOs, many CTOs are changing. But this is an evolution, which I think, as we see in the poll, it's not 10-90%, it is 40-60%.
Yeah.
So it's not that bad. So we have many service providers who have invested and many who are investing, but there's still some way to go.
And generally, do you see security sitting in a broader IT bucket, or does it have its own budget?
Do you want me to answer first?
Yeah, well, Hillary, you have to go first.
No, I mean, I think the models do vary a little bit, but I think, it's part of that transition that we were just talking about security being everyone's responsibility, right? So there are certainly models that say that, 10% of everyone's budget needs to be applied toward, security, for example, right? There are still, however, the need for, centralized security teams, security operations centers, all those other kind of things, right? And I think when you looked at this question on the telcos, that the 40-60%, as Pramod was saying, is interesting, because I think on the positive side, what folks do see their telco vendors working on are things that they just don't have the bandwidth or the skill to address, like what's going to happen in the quantum era, right? Is my telco ensuring that they are deploying quantum safe cryptography algorithms that, can't be hacked once quantum computers, reach the ability, that they will have in the coming years in order to potentially, crack current deployments. And so I think that there's this reassurance, that telco providers are taking a 10-20 year view in a lot of spaces, but at the same time, there's the immediate pressures of making this whole transition in security that we were talking about. And is your telco, necessarily the entirety of the answer to that? No, there's also within an enterprise, that is doing networking and deploying things to the edge and other things like that. There are also other vendors, and to some extent, the cloud providers become part of that solution as they work on distributed cloud solutions and software-defined networking and things like that. And so it's not all on the telcos either, right? And so I think this is where this space is kind of shifting, to your question.
Okay, thanks. Dean, anything coming in from any questions coming in?
There is, yeah.
Engaged.
There is one question that's quite UK centric, so I'll recast it a little. The question is, do any of the
does UK extend to Ireland? So if it includes Ireland, then Pramod can answer it.
The question is, do any of the speakers have any thoughts on the Telecom Security Act, which has implications on use of the cloud? So I guess if we could recast the question as kind of, how do you see governmental and regulatory influence on security requirements for CSPs?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Dean, and thank you for the person who asked. So NCSC, which is the government-facing, public-facing counterpart of GCHQ, has launched something called as TSR. And they now renamed it TSA. I know we all like changing names, right? So it was a Telecom Security Requirement, and now it's Telecom Security Act, or whatever it is. The point is, they have got a list of 13 sections, which they have to pass it on to service providers like Vodafone, BT, Colt, so on and so forth. And they have to follow those or reply back to NCSC saying how compliant we are, the suppliers we are using. Okay. Some of those questions are not yet thought about on the cloud factor, right? So it needs some rethinking to make sure that the cloud suppliers can also be brought into consideration. But the point is, the cloud providers are answering to those list of 13 sections, out of which 2 sections are not for cloud. One of them is for SIM card and one of them is for CPE, customer premise equipment. The rest of them we try to answer. There are some areas which need redefinition by the NCSA as well, because it's not catering for the cloud, but majority of it we are answering it and have answered it to the service providers on the TSR. So definitely it's a good sign. And to come to your line, Dean, it's very important that the government actually has some say in it, or has a minimum set of regulations or minimum set of best practices for the service providers to follow. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think it's
maybe we can just expand that discussion to government more broadly, and feel free to talk about US or wherever. I mean, in terms of the government role responsibility in this, do you see any clear direction?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to draw an analogy to another industry that I spend a lot of time in, which is financial services, right? I mean, the news of the £9 million fine that was levied did make it across the pond, right? So somewhat familiar with some of the circumstances. And in the US, there was also a prominent situation in third quarter of last year around a telco and a breach, right? But to kind of talk a little bit from the lens of another industry that is maybe a step further in some ways in some of these discussions of kind of regulatory influence on cloud adoption. Financial services, similarly, a couple of years ago, for example, there was an $80 million fine leveraged, by regulators against a bank that had breaches here in the U.S. And there have been a lot of discussions within the financial services community about the rate and pace of cloud adoption. And I think that, this goes back to, when there are incidents or when there are issues, does cloud adoption need to stop or be fully paused, or is there some inherent danger? And the regulators, actually, have an obligation to be asking those questions and ensure that critical infrastructure, is maintained at the right levels and deployed. But I think, what we're seeing is actually that, these initial challenges in some cases are causing much more structural discussions along the lines of what we were discussing earlier about like the technology world and deployment and IT and cyber all coming together, right? So it's not a stop, it's an opportunity to say, okay, what is my net security posture right now? What will it be once I've, begun to adopt more cloud? And it is very possible to have a structured conversation that ensures, in many cases, one of my favorite conversations in roundtables with CISOs is to say, do you think you're going to be more or less secure when you get to the cloud? And, when you see those kind of things in those breach reports and such, you would expect them all to say less secure or something like that. But no, in the vast majority of cases, and sometimes it's unanimous. When I ask that question, the answer is actually no, I think I'm going to be more secure when I get to the cloud. So, because I can now I can plan in a cloud adoption journey. I can think through that perimeter change, that Pramod was bringing up. I can train my workforce to all have a responsibility and an obligation for security, not just think that's someone else's job, right? So this becomes an opportunity to remediate technical debt, to educate the whole workforce, to really work through those things. And I think in that sense, cloud adoption is actually a great opportunity. And those organizations and enterprises that are doing this thoughtfully and intentionally can explain to their regulators then exactly what they've done, right? And that's what the regulators are looking for is, do you know what you're doing and why and how? And do you have a plan around this topic so that you won't have a breach? And that's an incredibly healthy conversation to have. And I think, you know, we can have that in a structured way as an industry.
There's an interesting context here around telecoms operators' relationship with technology more broadly. And telcos have kind of become procurement companies or construction companies rather than being tech companies. We're actually doing a piece of research on this right at the moment. And you know, they like to outsource things to vendors and give them end-to-end responsibility. And the in-house people are more operations deployment people rather than being people who build. So telcos are trying to change that now. That's certainly our sense, and bring in more in-house expertise. When it comes to security, is it very clear to the telcos you work with exactly what they need in-house and what they hand over responsibility to people like you for? Pramod, maybe if I can just let you.
Yeah, sure, yeah, thanks, Mark. So till 4G, it was very clear, right? We used to have very specific protocols for telecom, which is GTP protocols, SATP, diameters, M3UA, SS7. We know those protocols, and we had specified architectures by vendors and by HC specifications called 3GPP, so on and so forth. What are the mandatory security protocols and what are the non-mandatory, and which then various vendors like Cisco, Palo Alto, Microsoft, we all come up with firewalls. IBM, we come with firewalls and NOC and things like those. But 5G is a different beast. Right, completely different piece. There was never an option, a clean option specified by the standard to open up the packet core outside to the outside world, right? And if you look at the packet core, I'm sure you all know, but I'm obliged to state it. Whenever people deploy their network layer, they used to have an RF layer called the radio base station, which is basically an EMF wave, RF waves, that has got a backhaul fiber or whatever, and it has got some packet core. All these things are not that important, because really what happens is that this is just a transit for the subscriber to reach out to the outside world. The real power is at the packet core towards the outside world. Because if that network breaks, there is nothing the RF waves can do. There is nothing the fiber can do. Zero, Kuluraki, right? So now they are trying to think about how to secure that application layer, which is not very clear for service providers, because application is a very simple word to put out there. There are different kinds of applications. You can call that MEC applications, you can call that virtual machine applications, you call that SaaS applications, PaaS applications, IaaS applications, loads of them, right? So they are not very clear, and we're working very closely. And to be honest, vendors learn from service providers. How many of our slides we make, how many ever webinars we do, at the end, service providers are teaching us many things, right? So we learn from them on how to build an architecture. We learn from our mistakes, and that is how we build this architecture. So it's a two-way process. We have a thought process because we are working at the technology area, and they are the implementers of those technology, and we should learn from them how to implement securely certain technology.
And so, I mean, 5G core is a very, very relevant topic, because in 2022, we're seeing operators starting to deploy new 5G core networks. So is it your observation, just stick with you, Pramod, before going to Hillary, that is it your observation that that telcos are building that security strategy into what they're doing for 5G core, or is it going to be an afterthought?
Yeah, very good point, right? And very, very important, because I just finished writing a book on that.
Okay,
so,
I didn't know that. It wasn't a lead into you, but there you go.
Shameless plug-in, sorry. Shameless plug-in, sorry. So look, the point is, many of the vendors also have realized that they should build security as a foundation, because service providers are tired of vendors shoving products down their throat, right? And as a matter of goodwill and differentiator as well, the vendors have started to build in security on their foundations, hardening, software hardening, and things like those. And all the service providers now understand that security as a foundation is very important. How do we know they have understood that? Through RFIs and RFPs. There's a load of question now which speaks about hardening of your software, hardening of the hardware stack if you're providing some hardware stack. So there has been a lot of education going on by many service providers, but look, it's a new technology. We all are learning, and the habit takes some time to change. So I think there are some service providers who have really put their foot down and they've got a proper architecture. Some are learning as they go. Some are learning from us. Some we are learning from them.
Thank you. So Hilary, if I can bring you back to the first question I asked Pramod there, which was, where operators are responsible, where their suppliers, be they suppliers of services or technologies, in terms of how they work out what they do. The operators you speak to, are you seeing commonality in terms of their approaches, or are they feeling their way into this?
Well, I think we're definitely seeing some bright spots, and maybe also to kind of drift into the area that Pramod headed to there as well, with regard to kind of when there's new stuff, what do you do, right? I think one of the things that's been really exciting for us in this 5G space is partnership with AT&T, right? And well, how does that go? From a cloud perspective, well, 5G is the opportunity to deploy, richer functionality out at the edge. Well, okay, that then means that we are distributing distributed cloud technologies. We kind of reach out of the cloud and we deploy services, from a cloud perspective, out into locations, for oversight of things on manufacturing floors or in retail locations or immersive customer experiences, all these things, right? And this changes what the data is. It changes, what considerations are in network security and such. But kind of that open, vague space of 5G and what are we supposed to be doing is an opportunity then to introduce, and I'll throw out something that can be a buzzword, but it's not meant to, especially in this situation. But AI, right? I mean, that conversation is now coming in a new way, right? And saying, okay, how can we leverage AI to now in this new space out for 5G deployments? How can we leverage AI for network analytics, and how can we leverage AI to ensure that there is better security and understanding of what's happening out at the edge with these distributed cloud deployments? And so I think there's an opportunity when these spaces are new to bring in the latest and greatest technology that maybe wasn't retrofittable into existing existing deployments and existing places of network oversight in terms of security. And we've had a really successful partnership in doing lab-based in situ deployments for clients, bringing in AI, looking at network security, looking at deployments, looking at immersive environments, and bringing all these topics together: 5G, AI, network security, all these other kind of things. And you can create completely new constructs. You can improve security and other things like that when you're given this sort of blank slate. And I think that's the exciting opportunity that we're really seeing.
So as you were speaking, Hilary, it got me thinking, this one actually I did have planned for later on in our discussion, but I'd like to actually start bringing it in now, is the way that you and Pramod are both talking gives me the sense that telcos are starting to come to terms with the fact that security is more part of their everyday today, more part of their business, more part of their capability, more part of their products and services. Pramod, you also said at the start that security is still seen as being cost. But at some stage, will it not be the case that security will almost be part of the value proposition you're offering? The ability to offer secure connectivity is part of what you get paid money for by your customers, particularly the enterprise space. And how far away are we from that reality? Pramod, if I can just maybe come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And thank you for the question, Mark. Very interesting one, right? So if you look at the service providers, there are basically three divisions on a very high level, okay? One is the IT part, which is for the employees, IT stuff. And then you have got the telco infra part, which is basically the packet core, radio base stations and things like those. The third part is a value-added services, or what we vendors call the sell-through model. Here is where the service providers try to build up propositions and bundles and provide to the enterprise customers, be it small, medium, or large, or even consumers. So that is the monetization part, which is very important in 5G now, because in 5G, I'm sure you all know, but I'm obliged to state it, going forward in release 18, which is called 5G Advanced, 5G is already there in specifications, which has got something called as network slice as a service defined, which means that you have got B2X kind of deployment. I'm sure you all know, but I'm obliged to state it. They're speaking about B2B, B2C, B2B2C, and B2B2B. So it's B2X model, which will now be defined throughout various different integrations with the service providers by using technologies such as NPN or non-public networks called as private 5G in two modes. It's called SNPN and PNI NPN. Sorry for the jargon here, but we're speaking about standalone private 5G networks, and we're speaking about public network integrated private 5G networks. Why is that important in this discussion? Because there was never an option till 5G to deploy these kind of scenarios so that service providers could start using technology for making the revenue, and security is a big chunk. For example, if I'm Airbus or somebody wanting to integrate with you as a service provider, I want a minimum level of assurance from you that it is really secure, right? And that changes the mindset of many CTOs, because they are not investing in security just to protect their infrastructure, but also to monetize and spread goodwill.
So it seems to me as if there's kind of two value propositions for the telco as they interface with customers. On the one hand, we have seen many telcos investing in buying security management firms. That's been quite a big trend.
Correct.
But that's different from what you're talking about. What you're talking about is taking the core connectivity network product, building security around it to offer SLAs as part of, for example, network slicing.
Exactly. That is where the big chunk of revenue lies.
Very interesting. So, Hilary, do you similarly see us on that? You know, where do you see us on that sort of transition from security being, you know, a part of the cost base to part of the I guess moving from being part of the cost base to part of the value base, what we're really talking about here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's, you know, the CIO surveys show that, you know, cybersecurity is on the top of everyone's mind right now, right? And what leads to reassurance is, you know, both getting finer resolution on what's happening with regard to the core, and then also ensuring that there are other elements, for example, you know, open exchange of information, like collaborative elements across this topic in the industry, other things like that, right? So I think that, you know, as I look at this space, definitely see all the trends and such that Pramod was talking to, but I think there's also just a desire, you know, to get into topics around, you know, information sharing, to, you know, work as a community on response and other things like that. That flows then into things that are happening in this space, you know, trends around open source and other things like that, right? The topic has to be multidimensional, because it is the primary concern right now. And no one is going to deploy a solution at this point in time, I don't think, you know, that saves them money if they aren't very clear that it has equal or better security or, you know, SLAs or other things like that. In that regard, I mean, it's just not the kind of trade-off that anyone would make right now, right? So, yeah. You know, it's both the security of the core as well as, you know, adjacent products, and then, you know, what's going on in the open space. I think all of those have to be a part of, you know, any decision right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Pramod, you mentioned that, you know, 5G changes where we're at because of its very nature in terms of what it is. And interface into the cloud. I mean, can we just expand that discussion into IoT? And when we have IoT takes into a whole new, different, parallel but overlapping world of security, I guess. Yeah. And you know, and I guess, you know, telcos offering IoT services. I mean, security is very much part of the value you're offering, isn't it?
100%, Mark. So first of all, from a technology point of view, because in 5G, there's a lot of authentication mechanisms apart from what is in 4G, service providers now can consume those IoT devices. But why is IoT really a problem, right? So the IoT is not new. We all know that. It's been there for the past 10 years. When you go to a shop and tap your credit card or debit card, that point of sales machine runs on 2G, not on 5G, because 2G is cheaper and many service providers cannot switch off 2G. That is a real story. Now, speaking about the IoT itself, there are different kinds of IoT devices. Some are dumb devices, which does not have any intelligence, just a very thin device. Then you have got a semi-smart device, and then you've got a smart device, which has got a lot of intelligence and things like those. Now, if you look at the threat surfaces on the IoT, it's basically because of MIoT and M2M. MIoT is massive IoT. Then you've got many of these IoT devices which doesn't even have enough memory to do anything, right? So you can't have much security base there. And then you have machine-to-machine kind of communications with use cases such as V2X. V2X is vehicle to everything. Here is where in 5G, the biggest threat surfaces of IoT is peer-to-peer, right? You never had peer-to-peer communications in 4G, but in 5G now, an IoT application of a car can have a peer-to-peer discussion with that pedestrian traffic light to allow the car to pass or not. Of course, there are many standards like ATIS and things like those, different story. But on IoT, we never had peer-to-peer communication before on a service provider network, right? So because of these new peer-to-peer communications, use cases and things like those, service providers now have to think a different model of securing. They never thought of securing devices before, never, right? It was always securing the network and how to sell the security. Now, to secure the IoT devices, after trial and error, we have found out the holy grail is that nobody comes to each and every IoT device and tries to hack them. It happens at the application layer. Why? CM, PM, and FM. Configuration management, fault management, performance management, all are linked to the application layer. If you protect your application layer, you could protect your IoT devices. It's a long story. There's a 60-page on my book. But the point is that to secure the IoT itself, the service providers have now started building out small teams. They call them product teams. And they work with different vendors to make sure that when they launch certain IoT use cases, those are really secure and they can have that goodwill which they have today.
I guess the challenge with IoT is you have so many different players contributing to the solution. You know, you have the device, the application, the enablement, hardware, software, telco. So is it always clear who's responsible?
No, it is not always clear. But what we do, and sorry, I should pass the question to Hilary as well. But to answer the question in a very short form, it is always a learning on process, use case by use case. And we are learning that, right? So when we work with different service providers for an IoT use case, the kind of model or a security architecture you build is not the same for the next use case. So purely it is use case by use case based, and some of them are purely to protect the devices, because massive IoT devices can be a bot or a DDoS attack towards your infrastructure, which you have never seen before. So yes, so we are learning as we go, Mark.
Thank you. Hilary,
I was just going to introduce the word data, right? I mean, I think that's a word that we haven't used yet here in the beginning of this WebEx yet. But from a data perspective, I think that's an important element to bring into this conversation here around IoT and edge and 5G and all of this kind of stuff, right? Because the data and the data processing also brings into account not just security from a breach perspective, but also compliance, right? When you're talking about data processing. And so that's another layer that I think comes into play here. And if I think of like the different layers of this, there's, you know, what is processed on that end device, on that IoT device, and what is the endpoint protection that's put in place there. At the next layer, then there's then potentially cloud security to protect the data at the edge, because oftentimes in 5G deployments, folks are looking at some type of cloud, technology, distributed cloud technology, again, to enable that richness of function. So those IoT things may be interfacing with a small pod, so to say, of cloud capability. And then there's the network edge security, right? And I think each of these kind of envelopes also need to be cognizant of where is the data, how is it being processed, what's the permissioning on the different types of devices and such that are involved, and architecting the data and data security and perimeters and such like that then enables you to have a combined security and compliance conversation about what's being processed and what's being protected where. So it's both the processing and the protection that have to kind of come into play in order to have the total answer.
And I have heard it said, Hilary, I'd be interested to get your view on this, that security is one of the factors holding back the wider deployment of IoT more broadly. I think
it can be. Both security and compliance do tend to, hold back a rapid adoption technology. I don't think it's not overcomable though, right? And I think that that's where it gets back to the whole conversation at the beginning here with regard to putting in place processes and procedures and intentionality and design. I find that, it is often the rush to adopt without intentional architecture that can then lead to security coming in at a late stage and saying, no, thou shalt not deploy that. When you have that, process integrated up front, it doesn't become a blocker, right? It becomes a necessary part of the consideration for deployment to this type of environment, not a check that's done when you're ready to go live. And that's the fundamental shift.
Thanks. Pramod, can I just bring you in on that? I mean, is it overstretching it to say the security issues are slowing down the growth of IoT?
In my 20 years of implementing many technologies and IoTs and things like those, not one project manager has ever asked me, have you followed all the security controls before deploying or configuring? Never, never. Okay. So my point is, at the architecture level, yes, there might be some reasons or maybe a costing or things like those, but Hilary has touched those points as well, right? With my experience, the biggest blocker of deploying IoT is, should we do this in 5G or could it be done using Wi-Fi or 4G? Should I use my 5G? Do I need 5G for this use case? So many of the brainstorming or the blockers of deploying IoT, I've not yet seen security as a major factor. What I'm seeing is that, can the service provider get the ROI, the return on investment of deploying these use cases on the 5G layer? But look it's a very wide world and different processes going on, but security I've not seen as a major blocker yet.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm aware of time. I'd like to just take us back to those results of the poll we had. 60% people say we're not spending enough, 40% say we are spending enough. The cynics among us could say there's certain people who have an interest in saying that there's not enough money being spent on security. If you take your car into the garage, they'll try and replace as much as they possibly can because they want to sell you things. So again, this is so I guess my question is, are there enough good examples of what can go wrong if you don't treat security seriously enough, specifically within telco, to persuade senior management that you need to spend more, treat it more seriously? Are we seeing enough genuine things going wrong? Hilary, maybe I can just turn to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I personally find a very high degree of consciousness on this topic. Pramod and I may be a little bit biased because ourselves and our teams probably tend to get pulled in by those that are concerned about these topics. I mean, I think that there is, growing understanding, even in the general public, because things have been on the front pages of major newspapers. In the US, we see things like executive orders coming out from the US administration. When did the US White House issue papers on cybersecurity and encouraging zero trust architectures and things like that, you know, but they have been in the last year and a half. And I think it's wonderful, right? Because it just increases the consciousness of these things. And so I think that there has been, you know, I think enough, you know, discussion, you know, and understanding of this, that it's being taken seriously, and things like zero trust, you know, architecture and threat and risk assessment and supply chain integrity and all those kind of things are now terms that we can much more comfortably throw around. They used to be this, you know, the fodder for domain experts, and now they're on the front pages of newspapers, right? And so I think the awareness is there.
And without being a doom monger, what could go wrong?
I'll let Pramod take a crack at that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? So look at, so giving specific examples, right? And 5G is the first architecture where they're using something called as SDA, service-based architectures, which is based on SBIs called service-based interfaces, which uses APIs. Okay, the entire network, okay, the core system is based on APIs, which my 12-year-old today uses to use a programming on the Amazon hub. Today, 12-year-old. My point is, previously, if somebody had to go and attack a telecom system, attack a GTP, SATP, diameter, M3UA, all those protocols, he or she needed a fair idea of what the protocol stack is, right? Today, everybody works on APIs. And just imagine, let me give you a simple example, right? The entire packet core is exposed using the NEF component, the network exposure function component that exposes the packet core to the outside world, all right? That is API. Let's say I'm a malicious guy, which I'm not, but I'm acting to be a malicious guy, and I try to access that API. I get a request back, a response back saying that I don't have the access to that API, but on the bottom it says from Tomcat Apache version 3.2. That is enough for me to attack your infrastructure. I'll go to the internet, I will look at Tomcat Apache 3.2, understand all the vulnerabilities, come back and attack your infrastructure with the vulnerabilities. And once I break your APIs, you cannot do anything about it. Anything. I own you, right? And that is the things which we should worry about. Talk about TSLs. We use all these TSL version 1.3 and whatever TSL comes up in the picture, it all works on PKI, public key infrastructure. What are they based upon? RSA algorithms. Quantum computers can break RSA algorithms in nanoseconds, right? Not even milliseconds, right? And even if we use lattice algorithms, not all cryptographic constructs of lattice are quantum safe. So my point is, there's a lot of things out there, and as simple as APIs can break your entire construct. Sorry to be so much animated about it, but I love that stuff, and that is the reason I was a bit.
But when people say things like, you know, a cyber attack could bring the internet down.
Oh, not internet.
The thing that crosses my mind there is that there's so many different parts within that word, the internet. It's very it's intangible, isn't it?
DNS, right?
So what is the telco part
exactly
of that?
Yeah. So today, when I use google.com, it is DNS. Somebody has to resolve that DNS. It can be on my cache on my browser, or can go to a recursive server, then to an authoritative server, then to a root server, till I reach google.com, right? Google server, right? Yeah. If I break the DNS layer, it is kaput, right? Nothing would work, because then I have to put in IP addresses, and nobody remembers IP addresses of all this. So that is one example, very, very simple example. The other way I could do is take down your complete authentication layer. I can log into a system, and I can make sure that all the subscribers need not be authenticated, which means that now I can make free roaming calls and things like those, and even incoming roaming, outgoing roaming, all goes on null encryption. So many ways to tackle it. I don't want to give out too much, but
sure.
Yeah, that's the story. Sorry.
So I think just wrapping up here, if I can come back to you, and we live in a troubled world. And increasingly we see instability, more nationalism, and I think part of that is going to result in more cybersecurity threats and attacks. I mean, is that? It would seem to me as an observer, but I don't live and breathe that this day to day, that we are going to go through a period for the foreseeable future of an increased number of cybersecurity threats. I mean, is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, though, we have been on a rising period of cyber threats for the last 2 full years. If you look at data going back to the beginning of COVID, and the IBM X-Force has released a number of very interesting publications, and they're kind of doing an annual survey looking at threat vectors and rates and things like that. Definitely worth reading for anyone that hasn't seen that. But I think that, whether it was, pharmaceuticals or financial services institutions, retail institutions, everyone has been reporting higher and increasing rates of cyber threat since the beginning of the pandemic, to be honest, just because so much changed. And now there's the addition of geopolitical situations. But I think that in some ways, fortunately, these conversations began in more earnest in many organizations 2 years ago. With workforce going home, is mentioning that first point of telco connectivity really caused everyone to re-examine, what their readiness was, what their threat, issues were. And, now then, there are, new types of threats and things like that are beginning to emerge. But in my mind, this is a continued conversation to an escalated and aggravated situation that we all entered into a couple of years ago.
Thanks. Pramod, just final word to you.
Yeah, it's a bit sad to see that Slavic brothers going on there. But to answer your question on a big higher level, I think that it's a natural evolution that we're going through. This is a journey. So we can never say that, we have secured our network 100%. Never. The journey, new technologies come in, but we also have to remember about the legacy technologies which we have got in the network as well. So I think it's a natural evolution. It's a very good place to be in. Very exciting to work with customers, very challenging, as well as the adrenaline flow is quite good as well. So I think good market situation, people are interested in security, and IBM, Microsoft, we are there to help them on their journey.
And before I let you go, Pramod, you say you've written a book. So what's your book? I'll let you have a plug. So what's your book called?
Yeah, it's Securing 5G and Evolving Architectures.
Available at all good bookshops.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes,
excellent. So thank you to you, the audience. Hilary and Pramod, you've been terrific. So thank you so much for being so open with us. Dean, thanks very much for moderating. I learned a huge amount from it. I hope you did too. And thank you very much indeed for all your help today.
Thanks for having us.
See you soon. Bye.